Over the next few episodes, I will be presenting a piece of creative nonfiction I wrote for a class in my PhD program. As I've explained before, COVID meant that there wasn't much of a chance to go outside and do formal research for my dissertation, and therefore I had to find other things to write about. This was one of them. Just so you know, this was written about 3 years ago. Things have certainly changed a lot since then. With that said, I'd like to present Finding My Grief. It was a late morning, but I was still exhausted. Sleeping on the tiny, lumpy couch did not provide me with any sort of rest. Going to bed at 4 a.m. the night before certainly didn't help either. The many heavy footsteps in the tiny trailer made it nearly impossible for me to obtain any sort of deep sleep. When I awoke, I mindlessly flipped on the TV, hoping to distract myself. Some random movie started, one I had never seen before. The opening credits focused on a truck driving down a lonesome road. Johnny Paycheck was blaring from the lead's speakers, and he sang, "Well, I say, friend, don't take her, she's all I've got. Please don't take her love away from me." The sink turned on in the kitchen behind me. I quickly turned around to find Meemaw standing there. She was sluggish, and obviously hadn't gotten any sleep either. Her eyes were bloodshot, but she didn't look like she had cried in a few hours, which I figured was a good thing. I noticed she was watching the movie as well. She listened to the music too. Oh no, I said to myself, turn off the TV, dude. I frantically started pulling up the covers around me, looking for the remote to stop the song from coming from the speakers, but it was too late. Meemaw gave me a fake smile. "Morning, Al," she said, sipping on her coffee. "Hope you slept all right." She turned to walk back to her room and began singing to herself, seemingly clinging to every word, almost like she had heard the old song for the first time. "I'm begging you, friend. Don't take him. He's all I've got. He's everything in life I'll ever need." Great, I said to myself. What did I just do? Merely a day before I was in school, completely oblivious to what was to come. A text came in randomly from my mom saying, "Call me, this is serious," or something like that. At first, I thought it was about Penelope. My family got her when I was 4, and we knew that she was slowing down. Sluggishness was typically a good sign that a Labrador was nearing its end. I called during my first free moment of the day. It wasn't Penelope. It was Poppy. I was somehow relieved that the bad news wasn't about the dog. My grandfather had finally passed, which was no surprise. We all knew it was coming for some time. Cycling in and out of the hospital, his respiratory problems had been getting worse than ever due to his COPD and asthma. The multiple packs of cigarettes a day probably didn't help much either. Mom broke the news through sobs and uncontrolled breaths. I did not cry. I was simply angry. What else could I be? Years of begging that he care for himself had only resulted in his apathy to life, even though his doctor told him he could live up to 5 years longer if he quit smoking. Poppy told us of their conversation through thick, sour smoke that seemingly always hung around the air in his orbit. The 5 extra years didn't matter to him. The extra time would have meant my high school graduation, a handful of other graduations, meeting great-grandchildren, and every holiday you could imagine being spent with his big, oftentimes unhappy family. Sitting on the porch and sucking in tar took priority, or at least that's how I viewed it. Who could really blame me for my anger? I also felt annoyed. It was the day of my thespian induction ceremony. Finally, I was going to light the candle and join the club I worked so hard to get into. Suddenly, I wouldn't even get the chance to really celebrate, seeing as how immediately after the ceremony, we'd have to load up the car and drive 5 hours straight to Georgia. I wanted to have fun with my friends. Maybe by going to Steak and Shake and getting something sweet to celebrate. I did not want to sit in a car for so long on such short notice. When everyone found out that my brother and I would not be attending dinner, their dispositions immediately changed. What was supposed to be a carefree night of celebration mutated into expressions of sympathy and support. People were caring and understanding, but I was not looking for those things. I was looking to be angry and annoyed. As a kid, my grandfather was the coolest person I knew. He was a war hero and a fisherman and someone so cool that he didn't even have to speak. When he entered a room, you knew. Why didn't he want to spend more time with me? Why would he put us all through this? Why would he leave Meemaw so alone? She deserved only happiness. Highway lights flashed like strobes and faded into nothingness, leaving me with only the dark night sky of the country. My ears were stuffed with tiny speakers, loudly playing whatever could fit onto those 64 gigabytes on my light blue iPod mini. "Let it be," crooned Paul McCartney. "I can't, Paul," I thought. Everyone was in their own worlds. Mine was statuesque and paranoid that someone would notice the tears streaming down my cheeks. These aren't tears of sorrow, I told myself, just anger. A young man could not be vulnerable. I felt worse than I thought I possibly could walking into the trailer. Meemaw was sitting there, crying, struck with grief and 55 years of for better or worse. There was nothing I could do to help. Catholic teachings and parables became mantras expressing that Poppy was in a better place now, even if he was a Baptist, and she was sure God would still let him into heaven. Meemaw was the glue that always held the family together, but now she was falling apart. When they moved up to Georgia only a few years before, we all questioned the decision. After all, Poppy's health was getting worse. Why would he want to go to the middle of nowhere? What would they do if there was an emergency? I asked my parents, and they joked that all Dowies wanted to return home to Middle Georgia to die, like elephants. Originally, I was told the story that the night Poppy died, he woke up in pain. Meemaw, who rarely slept full nights herself, ran into his room and helped ease his troubles with some painkillers. What was strange is she decided to stay with him, which was something she typically didn't do. She told us she lay next to him in bed until he fell asleep. She said he seemed at ease, and she reveled in the moment until she herself fell asleep. The next morning, she woke up, and he didn't. I've been told by one of my oldest cousins since that it didn't happen that way at all. I should have known better, even at the time, but I guess what really happened doesn't matter much. I prefer the story I was told. It's a prettier picture. In the years following, Meemaw chose to sleep in Poppy's room. At first, we thought she was just being polite and giving up her bed for others to sleep on when we came up for the funeral, but she never actually left his bed. She never seemed to want to offer an explanation why, either. Ironically, a Lowy family reunion was already planned for the weekend that Poppy passed. His siblings and cousins had already been funneling into McRae from all around the South to attend. Dad joked that Poppy was so cheap he didn't want people spending money to come to his funeral. Nearby, Little Okmulgee State Park hosted the Celebration of Life, a place used regularly for the not-at-all annual family reunions. Dozens of people I barely knew swarmed us, looking at us with that face, that "you're so poor and helpless and you lost your grandpappy and now we're all here to watch you squirm" look. I went on walks by myself, avoiding the crowd and the attention. I took photos of the foliage and talked to myself as a distraction. At one point, my father, who typically maintained his composure, grabbed my brother and I, leading us down a random road which led to a campground. He wanted to be alone. Nothing was said. All remained quiet. Like the breaking of a dam, he broke into tears. He hugged us. He never hugged us. This is the only time I remember him crying during my entire childhood. I didn't even see him cry when Penelope was put down. I vividly remember the hug, which is likely the last time he probably hugged me. He cried and told us how much he loved us. I cried too. So did my brother. Dad started a business to free up his schedule and help raise us. When Dad was growing up, Poppy was always off fishing, only coming home to bring gifts and beatings. Dad coached baseball teams and drove us to school. Poppy bought expensive things for the boys, even when Meemaw had to work 2 jobs. Dad would drink a beer or 2 on New Year's. Poppy would spend more time drunk than with his family. What did this all mean to Dad? What did it have to do with what was happening now? We stood there, saying things we never usually say to each other, and haven't even acknowledged since. Maybe Dad didn't say everything he always wanted to say, and maybe he actually said all the things he wished his dad had said to him but now never could. Eventually, the 3 of us returned to the pavilion, hosting the reunion with red, dried eyes and steady breaths. Not much more happened the day of Poppy's funeral. I was young. I moved on. and years later I realized I didn't really know Poppy personally. By the time I became an adult, I was left with so many what-ifs. I hadn't spent the time talking to him like I should have when I had the chance. The only thing I have left of that day is a few photographs. One in particular shows all of us, sitting in lawn chairs, next to my grandmother, who is holding an oversized and pixelated picture of Poppy. Hey, Meemaw. I finally mustered up the courage to speak to her about everything one day while visiting her in her trailer before she moved in with my uncle in North Carolina, when she could still comfortably take care of herself. Can you tell me more about Poppy? I realized I never really got to talk to him like I wish I could have. Sure, honey. What do you want to know? I don't know. How did you guys meet? Why did he join the army? What was his favorite book? She sat there, somewhat unresponsive, pretty unwilling to answer. I met him in New Jersey, you know that. Yes, but how? Wasn't he older than you and from Georgia? How would you even come across him? Then she told me the story. One day, long ago, Sue went to New Brunswick with her friend Betty to shop. They were from a small town southwest of the big city comprised mainly of Polish and Hungarian Jews, many of whom had since become Catholic to blend in with their new surroundings and seem more American. Like any other public outing, they wore their best dresses, which were likely handmade since they both came from very poor families, and while waiting at the train station, Betty caught the eye of a young private in the army, a man named Buster. For Buster and Betty, it was love at first sight. Sue, on the other hand, was introduced to his sour-faced, quiet friend, Bill, who was also a private at the time and stationed nearby with Buster. For Bill and Sue, it was contempt at first sight. Bill thought Sue was foolish and immature, while she thought he was standoffish and rude. They were, however, both willing to support their friends and agreed to go on a double date with Betty and Buster, which was the only way Betty's parents would allow her to go out with an older man, especially one in the army. A few nights later, Buster and Bill went to Betty's house to pick up she and Sue. Of course, Betty could not sit next to Buster in the car because that would be inappropriate, so she and Sue were forced to sit in the car's rumble seat, shaking all the way to dinner and risking rain, which would certainly ruin their hair. Soon after the night of the double date, Sue received letters from Bill. He had a hard time showing it, but he actually liked her and wanted her to know it, in his own way, of course. Sue warmed up to him, realizing that he wasn't so bad after all, and quickly recognizing that pursuing a relationship with him was probably her best chance at getting out of her poor, tiny town. Bill quickly climbed the ranks in the army, going from peeling potatoes to help feed refugees in nearby camps, many of whom were from Hungary, which gave him another reason to hate Sue, to getting his GED and qualifying for warrant officer school. This meant he'd head south soon, and wanted Sue to accompany him. They had one speed bump, though. She was underaged, and needed parental permission to marry him and start her life. Sue knew she couldn't ask her grandmother, or older sister, or any of the people that actually took care of her. She couldn't ask her mom. It would be impossible to go to the psychiatric hospital upstate on her own, and nothing guaranteed her mom would even sign any papers. So, she reluctantly turned to her dad, having to track him down to one of the many bars he frequented in town. She saw him infrequently, typically only as he stumbled down Main Street. She was embarrassed of him. Who wouldn't be embarrassed to say they're related to the town drunk? She marched in and demanded he sign the paper, mustering up the only courage she had in her body to demand her freedom. He had one question. Will this man take care of you? Will I have to worry about you ever again? Fighting back tears, she replied, No, he will do more for me than you ever could have. Fine, her dad replied, signing the papers and quickly dismissing her. Get going. With that, she packed up her few belongings and headed straight for South Carolina, the only state they could find that would allow them to get married at such a young age. The rest is history. Meemaw, I stated, in amazement after she finished her story about how she and Poppy started their life together. How come I've never heard that before? She laughed to herself. I guess no one's ever asked. Well, thank you, I replied. So why did he join the army? As you know, his family was very poor, and he was the oldest of 7. He didn't want to be a dairy farmer like his father, and he had an uncle that told him the best thing to do would be to join the service, so he did, even before he graduated high school. Just left straight from Sanford and never looked back. It actually took months after we got married for him to tell the army to send his paychecks to our bank account. As soon as he joined the service, he sent all his money to his mother to help with his siblings. He loved his parents and wanted to do whatever he could to help them. We just needed the money more since we wanted to start our own family. Wow. I didn't realize he cared that much about everyone. Mimo laughed. Oh yeah. We almost didn't get married since I was a Yankee, Hungarian, and a Catholic, but Mrs. Lowy could see how much Pop wanted to marry me and eventually gave us her blessing. Especially after I let her teach me how to cook. Mr. Lowy, on the other hand, loved me from the start. They were great people. And sorry, Al, I don't remember what his favorite book was. Okay, I responded. Well, what was it like when you had your kids? Kid number 1. Well, we had the first just before Germany, soon after we got married, but we quickly returned to the U.S. after. Pop was an officer at the time and got promoted to being a drill sergeant. Germany was fun, and I wish we could have stayed, but the base was no place to raise a kid. We did have a dog when we were over there, but had to return it because it didn't speak English. So what about your second, Mimo? Any reason why he doesn't have a middle name? Kid number 2. He was born in North Carolina. Poppy was out in the field on a training exercise when I went into labor, and he refused to come to the hospital to help me during the pregnancy. He hadn't shown up by the time the baby came out, and I kept having one of the other officers' wives call the field to update him and ask what he wanted to name the new baby, but he was so impatient with me that he told me he didn't care and that it was up to me. They wouldn't let me take the baby out of the hospital without naming it, but I couldn't come up with any names. Finally, a nurse suggested his name, and that was that. I couldn't think of any other names and just wanted to go home, so I didn't give him a middle name. That's why his middle initial is S. It stands for space. I laughed. That's not surprising about Poppy, I said through a chuckle. Kid number 3. The third was born in Alabama, or was it Georgia, when Poppy was training to fly helicopters. By the time he came around, Pop knew I was mad at him for not being there with the second, and as soon as he got the call that I was in labor, he rushed back from training. When I got to the hospital, a nurse said, "Don't worry, Mrs. Lowy, your husband will be here for the baby." But I knew that was wrong. The baby wanted to come out, and he was born before Poppy could get there. His middle name is Alexander, after my brother. And then my parents told him I'm named after him, which I don't think is actually true. We both laughed. Child 4. Then there was your father. I had him after Pop returned from Vietnam. He was born in Orlando. Pop started fishing when your dad was 4.5 and was gone for a lot of his childhood. Wow, okay, I said. And what was Poppy like to each of them? Would you say they were all treated differently? Absolutely. How so? Child 1. Well, Billy was the oldest, and we definitely spoiled him. We still had money then, and when he was the only child, we gave him everything. Pop always expected great things out of him, since he had it so much easier than we did when we were growing up. Pop would discipline him sometimes, but he wouldn't really hurt him that much at first. He would buy Billy little army outfits and encourage him to join the military, too. We could tell Billy was kind of nerdy, too. He didn't do great in school, but certainly always passed his classes. Child 2. The next was treated much differently than Billy. You know he's dyslexic, so he had a learning disability. At first, we didn't know that, and the people at his school thought he might have been stupid. He was almost sent to a school for the learning disabled. When Pop found out, he thought he was just lazy, and he beat him so bad. He'd smack him in the knuckles with a ruler or make him hold his thumbs out on the table and smash them when he was doing homework and got an answer wrong. Even after we got the specialist to say that he had a learning disability, Pop didn't want to believe it. Pop always called him fat and stupid and believed it. I had one of the doctors tell me that he was smart but just couldn't read like you or me, and that if he got a job doing something with his hands, he'd excel. Child 3. The third was a different story entirely. He was always so weird as a kid and didn't mind getting in trouble. He'd always pick fights with his brothers. Hell, one time he picked up a spear that Poppy sent us from Africa and threw it at his older brother. Thankfully, he missed. When I tried to break up the fight after, they broke my ribs. He was always misbehaving, and whenever Pop was home, he'd beat him so badly you almost wouldn't believe it. There were times Pop would hit him so hard I'd have to put lotion on his legs and back to help make his skin feel better. I think he became so afraid of Pop that he always tried so hard to make Poppy proud because he was so afraid. Child 4. When your dad was born, I told Pop that I'd kill him if he ever laid a hand on my baby, and he never actually hit him. He went really easy on your dad too, especially after your dad had that grand mal seizure and almost died. We don't know what we'd have done if we'd lost him. Pop did still call him fat and lazy a bunch, though. That was until we took him to the doctor and found out he had a bone disease in his knees and your dad couldn't run. Pop called him names all the way until the day your dad got surgery, and he realized the doctors weren't just making things up. He felt bad after, but obviously never apologized. So, I said, do you think that all of the different ways Poppy treated the boys led them to all turn out differently? Like, if they hadn't been so far away from each other in age, and if Poppy had treated them more alike, they wouldn't have had vastly different lives when they grew up. Just think about all that they've done in all of their relationships and kids and everything. Why are they so different? Child 1. Of course. Billy got married at 18 to his first wife, who was a few years younger. She lived with us until they moved out. He got a job working at 7-Eleven right out of high school. They even started paying for him to go to college and everything. He didn't even really start classes, though. He got into drugs and hanging out with his friends, playing foosball and things like that. Looking back on it, he obviously had mental problems for a while, but we didn't do anything about it. We couldn't. Pop wouldn't let us talk about it, which definitely didn't help, and I tried to ignore it because of what happened with my mother. Then he and his first wife got a divorce, and he met his second wife, who hated me. She drove him away from us, and he ignored all of us for years. They had their 2 kids, my first grandkids, and she used to abuse those kids so badly. That's why he divorced her. When he finally started coming around us again, he didn't even call me Mom, just Sue. After that, he met his third wife and had his next 2 kids. Once he used her name to scam people and steal money, she kicked him out and divorced him. As you know, after that, we tried to let him live with us on and off, but Pop didn't like it. But I always blame myself for all his problems. I always told myself that if we had done something to get him help with his head sooner, he wouldn't have been in a bad place. I figured that's why he was homeless so often. He also didn't want to get a job, so he didn't have to pay all the child support he still owed. Now, all 4 of his kids have grown up, with their own mental problems, and whatever else they're going through. Maybe his daughter wouldn't have had all 5 of her kids while on drugs, and maybe his oldest son would still be around today, but who really knows, you know? Child 2. The second got his job as a truck driver, which made Pop proud because he was able to make something of himself without having to read or write. He's done pretty well for himself, too, leading the yard and all. He had his first daughter with his first wife, and after they got a divorce, he met his second wife. They had their second daughter. I think he does a pretty good job now as a father, and he's still with his second wife, so he turned out pretty good. And he's a great grandpa. Child 3. As far as our third son is concerned, that poor boy joined the military right out of high school to make Pop happy. He was such a troublemaker in school, and we were so glad he joined. He went in with his best friend at the time, who also always got in trouble, and we were relieved they didn't get assigned to the same jobs because it wouldn't have been good for either of them. But he traveled the world, and when he got out, he used the GI benefits to get his college degree and master's degree. Pop was so proud to go to his college graduations, and I know he was just trying to make Poppy proud. Then, when he met his wife, we liked her, but didn't like how she kept making him distance himself from the family. They even eloped without telling us. They had their 2 daughters, and were happy for quite some time until he had to travel a lot for work, and, was drinking and smoking all the time didn't help with things with his own family. He was so hurt when his wife divorced him because he felt like he had sacrificed so much for she and the girls. I'm so happy he left his big job in California, but he was certainly making a lot of money, which seemed to make everyone happy. Child 4. Then there's your dad. He was working practically full-time before he even graduated high school, and we haven't really told any of the other boys, but he helped Pop and I out for a while financially when he was living with us. That could have been because we let your mom live with us for a while when she got kicked out of her house. Did you know that Pop was the one who immediately told her to move in with us when he found out that she was living in her car? He didn't want to hear about any young ladies living on the street and being in danger. Once they moved out, your dad and mom still tried to help us when we needed it. Lord knows Pop never asked for any help, but we certainly appreciated it. Then, when they had you and your brother, and you know what he was like as a father better than I do, he loves you boys so much and has always been so willing to give up anything to help you two. You know what, Alex? When you think about all 4 of the boys separately, they really did turn out so different because of how Poppy treated each of them. Agreed, I said. Do you think he changed as a father after he got back from Vietnam? Absolutely, replied Mimo. He didn't drink as much and wasn't as willing to hit the boys. He disciplined them, sure, but nothing like when he got back. It's a wonder my dad got by as unscathed as he seemed to have. Well, by the time Bruce came around, Pop was fishing a lot and wasn't really around much, so I mostly raised him myself. Your dad was the only one born after Pop was over in Vietnam, and I think Pop was just tired after that. I don't know. It was a long but happy 55 years. Please don't forget just how close we all were when Poppy and I were living off of Redfern. Your uncle and his family might have been living in California, but everyone else got to visit often, and we had so many wonderful times together. Poppy was happy to be around everybody, and really loved you all. After this particular conversation, I asked her to look at pictures with me and just talk about them. First, we looked through her many photo albums which sat perpetually on her coffee table in the den, typically used as conversation starters for visitors. We came across photos of the trailer when they first moved up, before all the work was done to it. The elephant joke about Poppy quickly rang in my head. Why did you guys move up here in the first place, if we had such a great time in Orlando? Why leave? Because, she replied. He didn't want anyone to see him weak. He loved you kids. He didn't want to leave you, but he couldn't stand the thought of you seeing him struggle, and when he started to get really sick, he was determined to leave so you didn't see him that way. He was always really harsh on himself, saying he was good for nothing or useless. I always had to tell him he wasn't. He'd just get down on himself sometimes and talk about himself like he was worthless. I almost refused to go. I didn't even pack any of my stuff up until the morning your uncle came to load up the moving truck with our stuff. I realized I couldn't change his mind. Her response left me speechless. Do you think his time as a soldier had anything to do with him being like that? Of course, she replied. He wanted everyone to think he was big and strong and put together. That's how officers always had to be. He didn't fool anyone, though. Even before he got sick, he was 6 feet tall and only 120 pounds. He was the only man I've ever heard of that was too skinny for the military uniform after he got out. So why is there the elephant joke? It was easier for him to say that than tell people he was scared. Next, we started walking through the trailer until we got to Poppy's old bedroom. I saw all of his stuff still sitting on the nightstand and the pictures of his parents still hanging on the walls. His wallet was still tucked away where he last left it, almost 10 years before. At the foot of the bed sat Meemaw's slippers. I never asked her why she slept in that room. I always told myself she was sleeping there for some grand romantic purpose, perhaps to make up for all the nights they couldn't sleep in the same bed due to his nightmares, trying to get back something that was taken from her long ago. Or maybe just to feel close to him again, to feel the faded outline of his body in the springs. Why do you sleep here? I asked hesitantly, expecting a beautiful answer, an explanation like one of the ones in my head. Because I'm an old lady and I live alone in the middle of nowhere, and this room is closest to the front door. If someone tries to break in, I want to be so close I can hear them and call the police. My grandiose ideas were shattered, knocked away by the sheer force of practicality. Besides, she added, I've heard that a lot of wives in a lot of different cultures sleep in their husbands' old beds. I guess I'm just doing what all women do. Her answers slightly restored my intrigue and suppositions. Then, just across from Poppy's office, which held the large pixelated picture Meemaw held during his celebration of life, we came across the first photo they take of a soldier when they finish basic. It faded long ago, but still proudly hangs in her hallway of fame. Wasn't he so handsome? She asked proudly. Very. I wish I could have inherited some of his good looks, I quipped. No, unfortunately, you look too much like your Meemaw, she replied with a big grin. Was he a good soldier? I asked. Did people like him? He was around so many people and had so many jobs. What did people think of him? Well, she began, the best way to answer that question is to tell you this. One day, when we were living on base, he got a call that one of the men he was training went to the roof of the tallest building and threatened to jump. He kept saying he wanted to kill himself. For some reason, they called Bill. I didn't think it was a good idea to call him out there, but they wanted him. When Pop got there, he yelled up to the guy, asking him why he wanted to kill himself. The man yelled back down that the army was too tough and that he just wanted to get out. Pop got annoyed and told him that he either needed to jump right then and there or come down to stop wasting everyone's time. The story would have been unbelievable if I had never met my grandfather, but it sounded exactly like something he would have done. So what happened, I asked. She smiled. The guy climbed back down and asked why Poppy had to be so mean to him. I asked Pop that too. He told me that he wasn't mean. He saved the guy's life and stopped wasting everyone's time. That was just how he did things in the army. Finally, we got to the only picture that exists, which features Meemaw and Poppy, their 4 sons, the 4 wives at the time, and all 10 grandchildren. It was a graphic representation of everything Meemaw and Poppy built over the years, even if some parts have come crashing down since. I didn't ask about that photograph. Everything I needed to know, Meemaw was telling me through the look on her face. The pride, the love, the pain, the loss. It was all there. I was there too. The youngest, but certainly not the smallest. my curly blonde hair blowing in the breeze, standing just in front of Poppy and his muted smile. He wasn't the perfect grandfather, father, or husband for that matter, but I still miss him, Al. Me too, Mimo. Do you still think about him? Every day. In the years since, Mimo has shared with me something that she and Poppy used to say to each other. We were two halves and we still couldn't make a whole. They may have felt that way, but at the very least, to me, they were whole. It was on that trip when we walked through her rickety trailer and sorted through the things they accumulated over 55 years that I found my grief. I was no longer angry at Poppy or his decisions. I didn't resent his apathy or his beliefs. I realized that I couldn't understand why he made the choices he made, but I could try. Among the slides of Vietnam, letters to Meemaw, VHSs no one wanted, large collection of stolen beer glasses from Germany, and mountains of dusty sheets, I found my grief. It was the first real step I could take towards healing from his loss. I may have once been that angry teenager. I may have stayed that way for a long time. But it was through understanding, honesty, the search for truth, that I found a way to grieve. That grief allowed me to heal and start to understand a complicated person better than I ever thought possible. I'm glad I found my grief. I'm thankful I came to an understanding that made it easier to heal. An understanding brought about through a few simple questions and the patience to find answers, even ones I didn't expect. I'm saying all this to say, you can do it too.